I'll take the giant one. The lonely rancher man pointed at labor girl offered for $1 at auction. The auction block was no place for dreams. It was a stage built for desperation, where human dignity crumbled under the weight of hunger and circumstance. The air hung thick with dust tobacco smoke and the cruel satisfaction of men who measured worth in dollars and cents. Standing at its center was Mara, 6 feet and 2 inches of raw-boned strength that the world had branded as unnatural. Her calloused hands, capable of splitting logs and hauling hay bales, hung at her sides like weapons she'd forgotten how to use. The crowd circled her like vultures, their whispers sharp as broken glass. "Look at the size of her," one man sneered. "Ain't natural for a woman to be built like that." "Probably cursed," another added, crossing himself. "Devil's spawn, mark my words." The auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip as bids failed to materialize. From $50 to $20, from 20 to 10. Finally, desperately, $1. Surely someone needs strong hands for $1. Silence stretched taut as a hangman's rope. Then, from the shadows at the back of the crowd, a voice cut through the tension, deep-weathered, uncompromising. "I'll take the giant one." Every head turned. Every breath held. What do you think drove this mysterious rancher to bid on someone everyone else rejected? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your theories about what happens next. The voice belonged to a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains themselves. Ezra Cole stood 6 feet tall in his worn boots, shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a harsh world. His weathered hands had known rope and rifle plow and prayer. Deep lines etched his face not from laughter, but from squinting into too many unforgiving sunrises. Silver threaded his dark hair like frost on autumn grass. His clothes spoke of function over fashion: canvas pants worn soft by years of honest work, a flannel shirt that had seen more washings than most men saw winters. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, storm gray and unwavering, holding depths that suggested both kindness and steel in equal measure. "Sold." The auctioneer's gavel cracked like thunder. To the gentleman for $1, Mara's knees nearly buckled. Not from relief, from terror. She'd been property before to an uncle who worked her like a mule to a town that saw her as an oddity to be pitied or feared. But this man, his gray eyes held something different. Not kindness, not cruelty, just cold assessment, like he was buying a plow horse. He approached through the parting crowd, each step deliberate and measured. The townspeople stepped aside, some from respect, others from unease. Ezra Cole was known in these parts, a widower who lived 20 miles up in the high country, a man who spoke to his cattle more than to people, a veteran of distant wars who'd come home to bury his young wife and raise beef cattle in the shadow of peaks that scraped the sky. "Name's Ezra," he said, stopping before her. His voice was gravel and worn leather, aged whiskey and winter wind. "You got belongings." Mara shook her head, not trusting her voice. Everything she'd owned had been sold to pay her uncle's debts before they'd put her on this block. The dress she wore, rough burlap that chafed her skin, was borrowed from the sheriff's wife who'd taken pity on her nakedness, if not her circumstances. "Then we're done here." He turned toward the door, expecting her to follow. The walk to his wagon was a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Children pointed with the cruel honesty of youth. Women clutched their shawls tighter, as if her mere presence might contaminate them. Men spat in the dust and muttered prayers against the unnatural. Mara had learned to carry shame like a heavy coat. It kept the cold out, but it never warmed you. "They're afraid of you," Ezra observed, not looking back as he checked the harness on his team. "People fear what they don't understand," she replied, her voice rougher than she intended. Years of keeping her head down had made her forget how to speak with confidence. "Good." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, not gently, but not roughly either. Just efficiently, like loading any other piece of cargo. Fear keeps them at a distance. distance keeps you alive. The wagon rolled out of town under a pewter sky that promised snow. Behind them, the auction house grew smaller until it was just another bad memory in a life full of them. Ahead lay the unknown 20 miles of mountain trail and the uncertain future of a woman who'd just been bought for the price of a beer. The silence stretched between them like barbed wire. Mara studied his profile, strong jaw shadowed with stubble eyes that had seen too much hand steady on the reins, despite whatever storms raged inside him. He was a mystery wrapped in worn leather and quiet strength. "What kind of work?" she finally asked as they began climbing into the foothills. "The kind that needs doing." His eyes flicked to her measuring. "Ranch work, hard work, fence mending, cattle handling, wood splitting. You strong as you look? Stronger." The word came out with more force than she'd intended. Something flickered in his expression, approval maybe, or challenge. "We'll see about that." The mountains rose around them like cathedral walls, purple and gold in the dying light. And somewhere in those peaks Mara realized lay either her salvation or her doom. The ranch revealed itself like a secret grudgingly shared. Nestled in a valley where the mountains held their breath, it was a testament to one man's stubborn refusal to yield to time or circumstance. The house stood weathered, but solid logs silvered by altitude and seasons, a stone chimney breathing smoke into the thin air. Corrals and outbuildings scattered across the valley floor like pieces of a puzzle only Ezra understood. "Barns that way," he said, pointing with his chin as he unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency. "Loft's been cleaned. Blankets are folded on the hay bales. There's a wash basin and a mirror up there. Not much, but it's private." Mara studied the barn-solid construction, good roof, better than many places she'd called home. The logs were chinked tight against winter winds, and she could smell fresh hay through the open doors. What about meals? "Kitchen's in the house? Fix what you need?" He paused, considering his words carefully. "I eat at sunrise, noon, and sunset. Join me or don't, but I won't be keeping special hours." His gray eyes found hers. "Work starts at dawn. Fences need mending before the snow flies serious. You strong as you look." The question held no mockery, just practical assessment. Mara straightened to her full height, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Stronger? Good. You'll need to be." That first night she lay in the hayloft, listening to the sounds of a working ranch, settling into sleep. Cattle lowing in the distance like a bass chorus. Wind through the eaves singing mountain songs. The creak of timbers that had weathered decades of storms. It was peaceful in a way she'd forgotten was possible. But peace was fragile as morning frost. Dawn came pale and sharp, painting the peaks rose gold. Mara woke to find coffee steaming on the kitchen stove and a plate of biscuits wrapped in cloth. No sign of Ezra except a note scrawled on brown paper, "North Fence. Follow the creek." She found him wrestling with a section of barbed wire that had snapped in the night wind. His movements were efficient, but strained too much work for one man, even one built like Ezra Cole. Sweat darkened his shirt despite the morning chill. "Hand me that post," he said without looking up, wrestling with wire that seemed determined to draw blood. Mara hefted the 8-foot cedar post like it was kindling. Ezra's hands stilled on the wire, his head turning to watch as she carried it to the fence line without apparent effort. She positioned it in the post hole and drove it into the rocky ground with 6 swings of the maul work that should have taken 20 strokes and 2 men. "Jesus," he breathed, straightening slowly. "Problem." She wiped sweat from her forehead, genuinely curious about his reaction. For the first time since she'd met him, Ezra Cole smiled. It transformed his weathered face, chasing away years of grief and revealing the man he might have been before life had carved him hard. No problem at all. The days that followed established their rhythm like the slow turning of seasons. Dawn to dusk, working side by side in a partnership of necessity. Ezra watched her lift fence posts alone that would have required 2 men and a block and tackle. Saw her gentle a spooked horse with nothing but patience and soft words. Witnessed her split a day's worth of firewood in an hour, the axe singing through oak like it was pine. "Where'd you learn to work like that?" he asked one evening as they sat on the porch sharing a bottle of whiskey and the comfortable silence of shared exhaustion. The mountains stood purple against a sky shot through with stars. "Necessity," she said, simply accepting the bottle and taking a careful sip. The whiskey burned, but it was honest fire. "Uncle figured if God made me big, he meant me to do big work." Ezra studied her profile in the lamplight, the strong line of her jaw, the way her silver blonde hair caught the glow. What happened to him? Died drunk, left debts. Her voice held no emotion, but her hands clenched briefly around the bottle. "Creditors took everything, including me." Something shifted in his expression. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a fellow survivor. "How long were you on your own?" 2 years. Tried to make it work, but... She shrugged a gesture that somehow contained volumes of hardship. "A woman alone, especially one like me, doesn't get much chance to prove herself worth keeping." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of shadows across her face. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than she'd heard it. "You'll get that chance here." Winter announced itself with the subtlety of an avalanche. The first blizzard swept down from the peaks like the wrath of forgotten gods, turning the world into a howling void of white. For 3 days, Mara and Ezra worked side by side, battling to keep the ranch alive against nature's fury. The wind was a living thing, clawing at the buildings with icy fingers. Snow fell not in flakes, but in driving sheets that stung exposed skin like thrown gravel. The temperature plummeted until their breath came in white clouds and the water in the troughs began to freeze, despite the heated stones Ezra had placed beneath them. "Cattle in the north pasture," Ezra shouted over the wind as they secured the barn doors with extra rope. Ice crystals stung their faces like thrown needles. "They'll freeze if they don't find shelter. That gully offers no protection from this wind." Mara peered into the whirling snow, her height giving her a slight advantage in seeing over the drifts. She could barely make out the fence posts 50 feet away. The wind was a living beast trying to tear the breath from their lungs. "You can't go out in this, it's suicide. They're my responsibility." His jaw set with the stubborn determination that seemed carved into his bones like the lines around his eyes. "I won't lose them. Lost too much already." There was something in his voice, a pain that went deeper than concern for livestock. She understood. She'd learned that a man's cattle weren't just animals. They were his future, his independence, his proof that he could make something grow in this harsh country. "Then I'm coming with you. Like hell, you need me." She stepped closer, her height letting her look him in the eye despite his protests. Snow caught in her hair like scattered diamonds. "You know it. I know it. Stop pretending you can do everything alone." Something shifted in his expression, not defeat, but recognition. They'd been working together for 3 weeks now, and he'd seen what she could do. Fences that would have taken him days to repair, she finished in hours. Hay bales that required 2 men and machinery she hefted alone. "If we go out there, we might not come back," he said quietly. "If we don't go, they'll definitely die." The storm tried to kill them both. They fought through drifts that reached Ezra's chest but only Mara's waist. When a fallen pine blocked their path, she cleared it with her bare hands, while he guided the spooked cattle, her strength seeming to defy the very laws of nature. When his horse went down in a hidden ravine, legs tangled in deadfall, she hauled both horse and rider back to safety with a power that left him speechless. "There," Ezra pointed toward a cluster of dark shapes huddled against an outcropping of rock. 20 head. We need to move them to the south shelter before they freeze." The work was brutal beyond description. Cattle, half blind with panic and cold, fought every step. Their breath came in great clouds that froze instantly, but Mara's presence seemed to calm them, her size perhaps, or the steady confidence in her voice as she called to them through the storm. She moved among them like a shepherd among sheep, her massive frame a bulwark against the wind. They saved 18 of the 20 head. The 2 they lost haunted them both as they stumbled back to the house, exhausted and half frozen. The storm had taken its toll. They were caked with ice, their clothes frozen stiff, their faces raw from the wind. But they were alive, and 18 cattle would see another spring because of their efforts. That night, collapsed by the fire in the main house, they shared whiskey and silence. Ezra's hands shook as he lifted his cup, not from cold, but from the realization of how close they'd come to disaster, how close he'd come to losing her. "Why?" he asked, finally, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "Why what? Why risk your life for my cattle?" His gray eyes met hers across the firelight, searching for answers to questions he wasn't sure he should ask. Mara stared into the flames, searching for words that had never existed. The fire painted dancing shadows on her face, highlighting the strong line of her jaw, the gentle curve of her mouth. "Because," she said finally, "for the first time in my life, someone treated me like I was worth more than $1. The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Fragile, precious, dangerous. He reached across the space between their chairs and touched her hand just briefly, just enough to let her know he'd heard. "You are," he said simply. "Worth more, I mean." And in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. The employer and employee were gone, replaced by something neither of them had words for yet. Spring brought more than wildflowers and running water. It brought Marcus Cordell and his plans for the valley riding up the mountain road like a plague dressed in silk. Cordell owned half the territory and wanted the other half. He was railroad money and political connections, silk vest and gold watch chain. Everything about him spoke of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through purchase or pressure. His carriage was polished black lacquer with brass fittings pulled by matched grays that probably cost more than most men made in a year. "Cole," he said, stepping down from his expensive carriage like he owned the ground beneath his feet. 2 riders flanked him, hard men with calculating eyes and guns worn easy on their hips. "Good to see you again." Ezra stood on his porch, Mara beside him. The positioning wasn't accidental. They'd seen the riders coming an hour ago, had time to prepare. "Cordell, you're trespassing." Just being neighborly. Cordell's smile was all teeth and calculation, the expression of a shark scenting blood in the water. His eyes found Mara, widened slightly at her height, then narrowed with something ugly. Recognition, maybe. Or hunger. Well, if it isn't the giant girl from Millfield. "I heard you'd been sold at auction. Didn't know Ezra was the buyer." Mara felt ice form in her stomach. Millfield was 3 territories away. How did he know about her past? "State your business," Ezra said. His voice carried the flat tone Mara had learned meant trouble brewing like a thunderstorm on the horizon. "Water rights mainly." Cordell pulled out a leather portfolio with theatrical precision, his movements calculated for maximum effect. "The railway needs a reliable source for the new depot down in Silver Creek. Your creek feeds the whole valley. I'm prepared to offer a fair price." "Creek's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, Cole. Just a matter of price." Cordell's gaze shifted back to Mara like a snake eyeing a mouse. "I remember you now. Your uncle owed some friends of mine money. Gambling debts, wasn't it? Debts have a way of following people even across state lines." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Mara felt the familiar chill of being hunted, but this time it was different. This time she wasn't alone. "You're done here," Ezra said. His hand rested on the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Cordell's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes like winter lightning. Think about my offer, Cole. Markets change. Neighbors can become unfriendly. Accidents happen to people who don't recognize opportunity when it comes calling. His men, 3 hard-faced riders who'd stayed mounted, shifted in their saddles. Professional gunmen by the look of them. Men who solved problems with lead and steel, who'd sell their souls for the right price. I had a neighbor once. Cordell continued, his voice deceptively casual. Stubborn fellow. Refused a perfectly reasonable offer for his water rights. Tragic what happened to his barn. Fire, you know. These mountain winds, they spread flames so quickly. After they left trailing dust and threats, Mara and Ezra stood in the settling quiet. The air seemed thinner, charged with electricity like the moment before lightning strikes, both understanding that the war had just been declared. "He'll be back," Ezra said, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "With more men," Mara agreed. "What do we do?" Ezra looked at her, really looked like he was seeing her for the first time. The woman who'd saved his cattle in the blizzard, who'd worked beside him without complaint, who'd chosen to stand on his porch when trouble came calling instead of running like common sense dictated. "We fight," he said simply. "Together." But first, they prepared. That night by lamplight, Ezra cleaned his old army rifle, while Mara sharpened the ranch tools that could serve as weapons. They spoke little, but the silence was different now, charged with shared purpose and something deeper, something that neither of them was quite ready to name. They came at dawn on a Tuesday, 6 men with the hard eyes of those paid to break things and hurt people. Cordell rode at their head, no longer bothering with silk vests and false smiles. This was the iron fist that had always lived inside the velvet glove, revealed at last in all its ugly glory. Mara saw them first from the barn loft where she'd been watching the eastern approach since before sunrise. 3 weeks of preparation had led to this moment, weapons cleaned and loaded, positions chosen with military precision resolve, hardened like steel in a forge. "They're here," she called down to Ezra, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. He emerged from the house carrying his old army rifle, the one that had seen service in places whose names he rarely spoke. The weapon looked comfortable in his hands, like it belonged there. 6 riders. Professional by the look of them. 7, Mara corrected, pointing to a figure trying to flank them through the trees. "1 thinks he's clever." Cordell's voice carried across the yard, honey-sweet with false reasonableness. "Cole, come out and let's settle this like civilized men." "Already settled," Ezra called back from behind the water trough he'd positioned for cover. "You're trespassing. Leave." "I'm afraid it's not that simple." Cordell gestured to his men, who spread out with practiced efficiency like wolves circling prey. "You see, I've done some research on your employee. Turns out there's a warrant for her arrest back in Millfield. Destruction of property, assault theft. Amazing what a man can discover when he puts his mind to it." Mara's blood turned to ice water. The charges were lies, but in a world where justice wore a badge bought and paid for lies, could become truth with the right pressure applied in the right places. That's when things got interesting. Ezra said, his voice carrying a note of dark amusement that made Cordell pause like a man stepping on what might be a snake. "Because I did some research too." The rancher stood up slowly, rifle held ready but not quite aimed. Yet. "Turns out your water rights claim is built on forged documents. Amazing what a retired territorial judge will tell you when you mention federal mail fraud charges." Cordell's facade cracked like ice over a spring thaw. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Ezra's smile was all edges and winter wind. "Judge Whitman was very interested in the signatures on your railway contracts. Seems he knew the men you claimed signed them. Knew them well enough to attend their funerals 5 years ago." The hired guns shifted nervously. They'd signed on for intimidation, maybe a little violence against a lone rancher. Federal charges were a different kind of trouble entirely, the kind that followed a man across territories and put him in front of hanging judges. That's when Mara made her move. She dropped from the loft like a vengeful angel landing behind the man trying to flank them through the timber. Her arrival was so sudden, so unexpected, that he turned with his mouth open in surprise. She disarmed him with a casual backhand that sent his rifle spinning through the air, then lifted him off the ground by his shirt front like he weighed no more than a child. "Gentlemen," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I believe you're trespassing." The sight of a woman holding a full-grown man off the ground with one hand did more to end the confrontation than all of Ezra's legal threats combined. Cordell's hired guns were tough men, but they weren't stupid. They recognized a force of nature when they saw one. "This isn't over," Cordell snarled, but his bluster rang hollow as his men mounted their horses with unseemly haste. "Yes, it is," Ezra said quietly, "and if I see you on my land again, I won't be nearly so charitable." They rode away like devils fleeing the sunrise, leaving only dust and the acrid smell of fear behind them. After they disappeared in a cloud of dust and wounded pride, Mara and Ezra stood in the sudden silence of victory. The morning sun painted the mountains gold, and the creek sang its ancient song of water over stone. The air smelled of pine and possibility. "Think they'll be back?" Mara asked, setting down the man she'd been holding like a sack of grain. He scurried away toward his horse without looking back, his dignity as bruised as his pride. "Not them, but there'll always be others." Ezra leaned his rifle against the porch rail, the weapon no longer needed. Seems to be the way of things, someone always wanting to take what isn't theirs. Mara nodded, understanding the deeper truth. She'd been running from people like Cordell her entire life. Men who saw strength and wanted to harness it, or difference and wanted to crush it. Men who measured everything by what it could gain them. "I've been thinking," Ezra said, his voice carefully casual as he watched the sun climb higher over the peaks, "about making this arrangement permanent." Her heart did something complicated in her chest, like a bird trying to remember how to fly. "You mean the work contract? I mean partnership." He turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never expected to find. Respect, certainly, but something warmer underneath, something that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken. "This ranch needs both of us. I need—" He struggled with words that didn't come easily to a man raised on silence and solitude. "I need you, not just your strength. You." The words hung in the clear mountain air like a prayer offered to an uncertain heaven. "What are you saying, Ezra?" "I'm saying $1 was the best investment I ever made." His weathered hands reached for hers, calloused fingers intertwining with calloused fingers. The touch was electric, sending warmth racing up her arms and settling somewhere deep in her chest. "I'm saying, maybe we stop pretending this is just about work. Maybe we build something together, something that's ours." Mara looked out at the valley that had become more home than any place she'd ever known. At the man who'd seen past her size to her worth. At the life they'd built through shared labor and mutual respect, through storms weathered and enemies faced, through moments of connection that had grown into something neither of them had dared to name. Partners. She said the word, tasting like possibilities, like sunrise after the longest night, like coffee and honest work and the promise of tomorrows that wouldn't be spent alone. Partners. He agreed, his voice rough with emotion. In everything. The kiss that sealed their agreement was nothing like the romantic fantasies of storybooks. It was two people choosing each other against a world that had told them both they were worth less than they were. It was practical and profound, gentle and fierce. It was the taste of coffee and morning air, the scent of hay and honest sweat. It was the promise of hands that would work together, hearts that would beat in rhythm, lives that would be lived as one. It was perfect. Later, much later, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the peaks in a blaze of gold and crimson, Mara leaned against Ezra's shoulder and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From $1 on an auction block to a partnership worth more than all of Cordell's railroad money. From outcast to beloved. From giant to exactly the right size for the life she'd chosen. "Thank you," she whispered into the gathering dusk. "For what? For seeing me. For seeing past what everyone else saw." His arm tightened around her, solid and warm and permanent. "Thank you for being worth seeing." The mountains stood eternal around them, keeping their secrets and their promises. And in that high valley where the air was thin and the love was deep, two people who'd been deemed worthless by the world discovered they were priceless to each other. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of love found in unexpected places. Sometimes the best treasures are the ones others overlook, and sometimes the strongest foundations are built by the most unlikely partnerships.